All right, folks. I'm not sure how many people are going to end up coming in for the review session, but thanks for showing up. And again, what I want to do with this, with our last class period here, is just open this up for questions. Assuming that all of you are planning on taking the optional final, and so. What I want to do is go through if there's material that you're thinking back on. You're back, boy, I remember I had a hard time with this, or there were questions on quizzes that came up about that. Want to go through and help shore up any questions on any material you have over the course of the whole semester. So anything's free game. Remember that for this optional final, you don't have to worry about anything from the text. Okay. So all those text questions, the last 10 questions of those quizzes that was from the book material, don't have to worry about that. It's just going to be focused on things that we went over in lecture. So questions or areas that that I can go through and help provide some clarification on.
Can you remind me of when that is?
Yeah. Let me see. Court, I'll send out an email, a reminder. Do I have it on the syllabus? I can't remember. This has been a really weird semester, and usually, because I don't set when finals are, the university does that, and so sometimes people are mad at me because of when the optional final is, and I have nothing to do with that. But looks like our optional final is going to be Wednesday, coming Wednesday, from 10:15 to 12:15. Okay. So what I'll do, it'll be the same thing as everything else. I'll post a quiz. You'll have a bunch of time to go through and answer questions on that, and yeah, that'll be that. Any questions on material? But yeah, Court, I'll go through and verify that to make sure things haven't changed. Just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So be sure to be on the lookout for that email so that we all know sort of when this final is going to take place. Questions on material?
Is the material that's going to be in the final, you said stretching from the first quiz to the seventh, is that going to be like an even distribution of stuff?
Yeah, it'll be Michael, good question. I'm not going to overemphasize any of those things. Try and take even coverage from some of those different quizzes. So, I mean, what you might want to do in terms of a strategy is go back to anything from the lecture is fair game, right? But what I might do is go back through and take a look at quizzes where you did maybe better and quizzes where maybe you struggled a little bit more, and sort of before next Wednesday put a little more emphasis on those areas where you struggled, because those are probably going to be the areas where sort of you might have not had such a good handle on the material. Make sure you're square on that, so then when we move it forward, you got those things put together, right? And as you're going through, right, this starts to get into some of that recognition memory, right? As you're going through and reading through your slides and your notes, thinking back to those quizzes, you're like, oh, I remember sitting there and being stumped by a question that was asking something about this. Sort of focus on that, right? Take down notes and back, okay, so got that. And back, oh, I remember sort of being back and forth on this question on a couple of things, sort of kind of going through and shoring that stuff up. That'll help kind of give you direction, as opposed to saying, oh, here are all my notes for all the semester. Like, how am I going to go through and manage sort of the approach there?
With this last optional final, when will we know our final grade?
Right away. I mean, I can go through it as soon as it's done. Like that day, I'll let you know by Wednesday, where you're at. Because at that time, I'll have, I will have all all your research hours, like that's the unknown in terms of trying to post your grade. I don't know sort of where people are going to land in terms of their research hours and sort of whether or not they've had any unexcused no-shows. But by the time this comes up, I'll have all that sort of in the grade book. The only thing I'll need to do is go through and drop in the final score, so long as it is higher than your second low average. If it's not, then your grade just stays the same. If it's higher, I'll go through, swap that out, and then have those up pretty quickly.
All right, Dr. Club, I
Yeah.
did not do so hot in quiz 2, going
Okay.
over neurological systems and brain
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah.
I wonder if you go over that a little bit.
Yeah. So, and which part of that, Jonathan, are you asking about?
Probably just going over just the way that works. I'm looking at some pretty scribbled down notes here, and it's neurons, sensory neurons, interneurons.
Okay.
Neurocommunication.
Yeah. And the nice thing about this is where you all have, pretty substantial benefit over sort of non-COVID semesters is remember that we have video record of everything that we've done in every single lecture. So do go through, and on the main page, right, you just click on that archive to go back through as you're going through and studying and sort of get things shored up. But in terms of the specific neurons that we're talking about, right, this is our basic motor neuron that we're looking at right here, right, and just kind of knowing sort of general sort of structure, right. These are our dendrites. These are the fingers out that's receiving information from everything else. Thousands and thousands of adjoining neurons hooking in, and if we get enough signal, we get an action potential that starts at the top of the axon, sort of runs down your axon here, hits your terminal buttons, which is where we get into that neurotransmitter sort of communication. So when we're thinking about neurons, this is generally what we're thinking about. This is the archetype in our head, kind of the template for these neurons is the motor neuron. But we do have other neurons, right? These sensory neurons, these look a little bit different, right? The cell body or the soma is kind of right there in the center. This is just kind of a connector headed out there, right? Our dendrites are here at our sensory organ, and the terminal buttons are going sort of back wherever they go through and connect, right? So what we have here is, let's say, from your eye, we have neurons that are taking sort of light signals that are coming in, getting signals from your rods and cones, and then transmitting that back into your brain. So different kind of structure here. And this is just kind of what they look like. Interneurons, these are just kind of connectors, little adjoiners. Sometimes the terminal buttons of one, say, motor neuron don't hookily direct up into the dendrites of an adjoining motor neuron. Sometimes there's an interneuron in between there that sort of connects the two. Just a different neuron. This just kind of looks like this, where you got the soma sort of in this kind of the center, and the two axons kind of setting out sort of in different areas. Jonathan, don't worry too much about sort of this stuff. I didn't ask you a whole lot, or sort of nuts and bolts of these. Just wanting to make you aware that not all neurons look like our sort of stereotypical neurons. We got lots of different types that sort of look differently. Other questions?
Sorry, Dr. Tiff, just another general structure.
Yeah, no, this is perfect, Michael. What's up?
You said around 50 questions, right?
No, 50 questions specifically. So you're going to have lots and lots of time to go through and do this. Okay, so you'll be good to go. And it's multiple choice. It's the same stuff that we've been doing up to this point. So no surprises on that end.
Will you go over the brain structures, kind of like what each a region of our brain controls?
Yeah. So in terms of brain structures, right? Thinking about remembering in terms of just general division, and we think about this as evolutionary structure. Forebrain, this is the top, so this is the most evolutionarily sort of complex system, right? And here we've got the forebrain, right? Forebrain is your cerebral cortex. Remember, if you think about your brain as kind of like a mushroom, you got that cap on top. That's your cerebral cortex. That's all of this, right? That's your cortex, right? But that cortex is just kind of like this isn't your whole brain. Like your whole brain isn't a sort of a wrinkly mass going down in the center. That's just like a little cap. And we could pop that cap off. And if we do that, what we see is our subcortical structures. Okay, subcortical structures are going to be things like your hippocampus, your amygdala, thalamus, hypothalamus, basal ganglia. These are going to be structures that are hanging out underneath that cortex, right? As we go farther back, and this is all much more complicated than what we're presenting here, but for our purposes, talking about midbrain, this is reticular formation. This basically works as kind of like a superhighway, sort of going through, does some other stuff. And then we've got our hindbrain. This is like your sort of your cerebellum, your pons, your medulla. This is like old school, doing a lot of vestigial types of things there, right? So for your cortex, Sailor, so remember the main thing we talked about here is you got 4 primary lobes, okay, that are determined and identified sort of on the geography of your cortex by different fissures and things like that in your brain, right? So frontal lobe, this is all the stuff, and remember you got two hemispheres, sort of symmetrical hemispheres, sort of cortices on each side, right? But up here on the 2 sides of up here, I've got my frontal lobe. This is a lot of regulation, planning, speech, movement stuff, executive functioning type of thing, right? Sailor, are you a morning person? No. Okay. So maybe you woke up this morning and would have preferred to stay in bed and not get up. Is that fair? Okay. So your executive functioning, though, said, hey, what I need to do is I need to get up, need to get my day started, need to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's the thing that starts to help you sort of decision and plan and sort of do these sort of things. It's like this is the sort of the boss up here saying, this is what we need to do, even though we don't want to do it, sort of, or I need to sort of forget about this for a moment, change this over, problem solving and things along those lines. And so again, if we see developmentally, I'm assuming, Sailor, that you're better at making yourself get out of bed now and sort of attract to things that you want to do than when, say, you were 15, right? And a lot of that is just because, remember, those frontal lobes continue to develop until we're early 20s and things along those lines, right? So the things we're able to do now they're easier for us to do than we were in sort of when we were sort of adolescents. This is why programs like DARE and abstinence programs don't work, because people are working with a limited set of tools in adolescence for sort of regulating behavior and stuff, right? So concentration, attentional control, some speech movement types of things, but generally that's what we're talking about, frontal lobes. Temporal lobes, pretty much a lot of speech stuff, right? We talked about those aphasias when people, particularly your left hemisphere, right? Left temporal lobe, huge in regulating speech, but we see some stuff with smell and hearing. Our parietal lobe, this is one we always forget about. It's the one that kind of sits on top right here. Sensory information, taste, speech, and then vision. This one's easy to remember. This is our sort of where our visual processing stuff is going, at least initially, before it goes other places. Okay, so thinking about that, we talked about our motor cortex and our sensory cortex, right? Remember, motor cortex, this is on the back part of our frontal lobe, and this allows me to sort of talk and wave my arm around and things along those, regulates sort of movement. Our somatosensory cortex, or our sensory cortex, this allows me to feel sort of my keyboard, sort of what my coffee cup feels like, is very smooth, right? The sensitivity, if I take a sip of my coffee, right, I can feel the texture on that glass much easier because our lips are very, very sensitive versus if I were to rub it with my elbows don't have much feeling at all, right? And so when we're thinking about our motor cortex and our somatosensory cortex, sort of the cool thing here is recognizing that the number of neurons in these cortices that are sort of devoted to different parts of our body sort of proportionally related to either the dexterity and the sensitivity of that organ, right? So my hands, both in terms of the motor cortex, sensory cortex, is very large. A lot of neurons there because we're tactile beings, and so we have a lot of sensitivity in our hands. My kneecap, probably less so. It only bends one way. Everything's going correctly. If that changes, I'm in a bad spot. Also, sort of not a whole lot of feeling sort of right there, right? Think about the front of your knee versus the back of your knee. Front of your knee, pretty impervious to sort of touch. Back of your knee, very sensitive to touch, right? So you're going to have different amounts of neurons sort of addressing sort of both of those. So we talked about homunculus kind of stuff going on there. Talked about a couple different aphasias, right? Sort of how we see damage in certain areas. This is how we know what parts of the brain are involved in certain types of things. Oftentimes it's from lesions or damage that people have unfortunately had to their brain. But what if we start to see damage to a particular part of the brain that produces characteristic deficits, that starts to help us generate hypotheses that probably this part of the brain is at least involved in doing some of this stuff. So talked about that a little bit. And then we got into our limbic system. Again, this is still forebrain. Limbic system, this is your hippocampus. There's going to be a lot of memory, right? If I took out your hippocampus, your processing of long-term memory would be problematic. All your memories don't hang out. They don't live in your hippocampus. But your hippocampus is important for helping direct and sort of process those to be stored sort of elsewhere in your brain. Amygdala, I often think about this as associated with some primal sort of affect stuff, a lot of fear going on in amygdala, a lot of those neural structures going on there with addition to some other things. Thalamus, this is kind of like your relay station. This is your post office sending things from one section to the next. And then your hypothalamus, think about this as your master gland. This is contains your pituitary and their sort of basic functions of organisms, feeding, fighting, mating, fleeing, right? Some of that stuff is sort of organized in hypothalamus. Then your basal ganglia, these are structures that help with smooth motor movement, right? So that I can go through and sort of move my hand around here. When we see people with Parkinson's disease, it's Parkinson's is associated with damage to neurons here in your basal ganglia that produces tremors and shakes and sort of starts to impact smooth muscle movement. Reticular formation, again, a lot of just a relay situation, taking things from down here to up here, but involved in sleep and arousal, attention, movement, things like that, right? If I were to lesion your reticular activating or your reticular formation, you probably see problems with sleep and attention and sort of arousal activation types of things. And then your cerebellum, hindbrain stuff. Okay. This is your cerebellum down here. This is a lot of vestibular, somatosensory sort of balance and things like that, right? Remember we talked about young infants are born and sort of your brain's not fully developed when you're born, right? So I can't teach a 2-week-old to walk because one, they don't have sort of muscle structure, but then also sort of they're still developing back there, right? Like I can't, if I took out your cerebellum, you just fall over. You couldn't sort of stand up, sort of coordinate yourself. Pons, again, this is sort of relay system, again, sleep and arousal stuff. And then medulla, respiration, cardiovascular function, all of that kind of vestigial stuff that goes on in your background, because it would be kind of a pain if I had to remind myself to breathe all the time or to tell my heart to beat all the time, like I'm doing this, right? This is all carried on automatically when we talk about or hear people who are brain dead in the hospital. That's generally what's going on, is that everything above the hindbrain maybe has gotten damaged or destroyed. This is like your life support. You'll breathe, your heart will beat, but sort of the functions of being sort of a person are kind of taken out there. So that was kind of a quick and dirty run through of that stuff. But did that help kind of sort of jog memory with stuff?
Yes, that helped a lot. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Other questions?
Will you be looking at sleep at all? Different stages?
Yeah. Stages of sleep will pop up. Do you want to run through that quickly, Jonathan?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. Okay. So stages of sleep. This is a little bit of sort of this is a kind of the classic model of sleep. They've made some changes to this, and so from your book, the categorization will be a little bit different. But for our purposes, remembering that if I just said, and again, like we all have been around people and sort of saying, are they asleep? Are they not asleep? Kind of hard to tell. Behaviorally, it's difficult to see and sort of determine like at what point does someone fall into sleep. For people who do this type of research, stages of sleep and wakefulness and sort of where people at are determined by EEG waveforms. This is electrical signals that we can measure from your scalp. Okay, that sort of basically it's activity going on in your cortex. And that electrical activity, we can detect it through the skin of your scalp and through your skull, through that first protective layer of your brain, and start to pick that up, right, with very sensitive sensors. And what we see is characteristic different waveforms that are help us draw that line between different stages of sleep. So beta activity, this is hopefully what's going on right now, right? You're alert, you're taking notes, you're paying attention, eyes are open, moving around. What we see is very sort of short, fast, irregular types of movements, okay? But if I were to ask you to close your eyes, to relax, and just breathe, clear your mind, and just focus on your breathing, some of these relaxation techniques that we use sometimes in clinical settings, what we would see if we had an EEG going on is we would see a shift from that beta activity to something we would call alpha. Alpha is still pretty fast, but their waves are much more regular, and they're slower than the beta. So things start to even out, look more uniform, and they start to sort of, this waveform starts to stretch out a little bit. It's those waves get a little bit slower. If during that relaxation technique you started to fall asleep, this happens sometimes. And so clinical says you got to wake someone up, be like, okay, so that's overly helpful. So you put yourself to sleep. What we would see from an EEG waveform is we would start to see theta activity, right? And so this is a slower waveform. It's hard to see in this, but it slows down relative to alpha. Okay, so that waveform slows down even more. If we start to see sleep spindles and K complexes in that theta activity, this is a K complex, so we're kind of going along, and then all of a sudden get a jump, and sort of going along, and then get a really fast kind of jagged section. This tells us that we've transitioned into, or the person has transitioned into early sleep, okay, stage 2. As we get into slow wave sleep, what we start to see is delta activity. So this is big, slow waves, okay? And what we see between delta activity, stage 3 and stage 4 is just the amount of that overall waveform that's delta activity. So stage 3, some of it's going to be theta activity, but about 20 to 50% of that waveform is going to be characterized by delta waves. As we get into deep sleep, now over half of your overall waveform is sort of this delta activity. And what we see in stage 4, deep sleep, right? Only things that are strong stimuli will go through and wake you up. Like I have to shake you up, right? And thinking about times where in your life, if you've woken up or someone's woken you up and you wake up and you're kind of fairly alert, versus times when someone's woke you up and you're really having a hard time sort of pulling it together and sort of orienting and figuring out where you're at. If that's the case, you may well have been in a stage 4, a deep sleep, when you woke up, right? We also see sleepwalking, bedwetting, night terrors going on in stage 4 sleep, okay? Someone remind me why we tend to see sleepwalking in stage 4 sleep as opposed to REM sleep? remember that in REM sleep, what happens is we go from this slow wave, so slow deep sleep waves, to something, a combination of theta and beta activity that basically looks like your brain is in some combination of wakefulness and early sleep. Okay, and so what we see here when people transition into REM sleep, what we see is sort of eyes moving around. I mean, your eyes are shut, but sort of we see eyes moving around as if you were sort of awake. Muscle paralysis, right? This is, and again, we talked about REM sleep disorder. If any of you have ever listened to some of Mike Birbiglia's stand-up act, or he's got sort of a kind of a one-man show kind of thing. So this is a character, you probably would recognize him if you saw him on a show or something like that, but he suffers from REM sleep disorder. And so when Birbiglia goes into REM sleep, his body doesn't paralyze. And so when he's having these dreams, he's up moving around, acting them out, which makes for some funny anecdotes, but at the end of the day is really, really disruptive, right? Because he's literally jumped out of windows and things like that while dreaming, because for most of us, our body shuts down. We're paralyzed. We can't move. Now, other thing happens too is sometimes people wake up from REM sleep, but their body hasn't unparalyzed itself. And so now I'm awake and I can't move. That's also terrifying. But what we see is our body naturally shutting us down to try and keep us safe. Also seeing genital activation occurring during REM sleeps. See a lot of dreaming. And what we see, which is interesting, is people starting to be involved to meaningful stimuli, right? So as opposed to deep sleep, where if I'm in deep sleep, someone's got to shake me to wake me up, right? Now, individual differences, but so it takes more to get me awake. If I'm in REM sleep, if you're in REM sleep and I say, hey, Madison, you might wake up and be relatively alert at that point, right? And again, what's interesting is it looks like our brain is actually, even though our body's shut down, our brain is still active. And so if I were to so Madison wake you up and say, hey, Michael's not relevant to you, right? But if I say, hey, Madison, you might wake up to that, right? Or, if I hear something, if I've got kids, right, and I hear sort of a kid crying, sort of I'm in REM sleep, going to wake up sort of immediately, sort of because that's relevant to me, right? And so if we go through and take a look at all of these stages, right, taking a look at sort of these alpha waves, this is restful wakingness, right? We see kind of this short kind of pattern here as we drop down into theta. We see those waves start to stretch out a little bit. When we go into stage 2, we see more theta, sleep spindles, K complexes. 3 and 4, these are those big delta waves. But then when we drop into REM sleep, we start to see things speed up, look much more jagged. You got some theta waves, some beta wave activity here as we work through. Okay. Now, if we go through and take a look at stages through the night, see the majority of deep wave sleep happening early on in the evening, REM sleep happening later on, right? And it kind of makes sense, right? If I need to get up at sort of 7, let's say, it doesn't make sense for my body to be trying to rouse itself out of deep wave sleep, right? What we see is that deep wave sleep happening more towards the beginning of the evening. As we get closer towards the morning, we're experiencing more greater levels of REM activity and sort of that sort of piece of things there. Okay. And again, sort of a kind of a quick scream through on that, Jonathan. But does that help? Is there anything in sort of this sequence cycle that could use a little more clarification?
No, I'm good on sleep, thanks.
Okay, cool. Always good to know that people are good on sleep. That's the one thing doing clinical work. Like, number one concern, like if someone's not sleeping, that's the worst. Like people don't. And so that's the thing. It's interesting. Like we know sleep is important. If we don't get sleep, we don't function super well. But still, not 100% clear on exactly what the function of sleep is, what it does for us. We know that like human beings can't die from lack of sleep. Like your body will shut down and force you into sleep. But in sleep research with animals, if you like force an animal, sort of actively prevent it from reaching sleep, and they've done with rat studies and things like that, the animal will stress out and die. But that's because there's been active sort of forcing that animal not to sort of engage in sleep, right? But for humans in sort of sleep deprivation studies. If you're not getting sleep, weird things start to happen, sort of mostly cognitively with stuff. It's hard to pay attention. It's hard to, and then people will start having sort of hallucinations and things like that if you keep them from sleeping long enough. And again, this is sort of forceful stuff, sort of actively keeping you from sleeping. But so we know that sort of a lot of, at least for adults, it seems to be cognitive types of things. This is why people will talk about before tests, exams, make sure that you've got a good night's sleep, because otherwise cognitively you're probably not going to be sort of at the top of your game. Other questions or material that we can go over?
Dr. Clapp, could you go over psychological therapies? From
Yeah. Yeah. And Michael, was there any one of those that sort of could use a little more clarification for you?
Not one specific, just kind of
Okay.
general.
All right. So, you're talking about these ones, the psychodynamic, the humanistic, and the cognitive behavioral?
Yeah, these ones.
Okay, cool. So again, these are not the only three sort of modalities of treatment. There are sort of people from other orientations and things like that. And even within each one of these, there's sort of sub sort of types and things along those lines. But the idea here is that sort of we've been talking about Freud and psychoanalysis, humanistic theory, and cognitive behavioral stuff for the whole lecture. This is kind of coming into sort of looking at how that manifests as approach to treatment. And so our psychodynamic therapies, again, these are insight-focused therapies. And again, the idea is to try and understand, and again, I'm not a psychodynamic person, right? So someone who's a psychodynamic person may take exception to my description, my sort of brief description of this, and say it's more complicated than that. Sort of it certainly is. But in general, sort of the general idea is that what we want to do in treatment is get at and start to understand or develop hypotheses about your unconscious conflicts, right? Sort of what's going on in your unconscious, things that have gone on in your past that you've sort of repressed out of your sort of active sort of memory that are contributing to whatever it is that you're sort of coming in to seek assistance with, right? A lot of this is looking at childhood, unresolved childhood experiences. Sometimes people will call it childhood trauma. I'm a trauma researcher, and so I sort of have a different operationalization of trauma, but sort of this idea that like I've had disappointments, sort of needs that weren't met in childhood, and sort of trying to understand how those things and those conflicts have developed into kind of my hang-ups today and have impacted my relationships with friends, family, supervisors, sort of other people in my existence, right? And so what we'll see is maybe some free association. So Michael, you come in, if I'm a psychodynamic person and you're just kind of talking to me about stuff, I'm trying to pick up and sort of get at sort of within sort of your general, sort of wherever your mind is going, is that telling me about sort of giving me information about your childhood hangups and unconscious conflicts, resistance, right? If you don't want to talk about something that I'm trying to get you to talk about, and you're like, I don't want to, you keep changing the subject, right? Or if you're not coming into treatment, sort of things along those lines. From a psychodynamic perspective, I say there's no mistakes. That's so your unconscious trying to thwart your sort of efforts towards progress in therapy. And then looking at transference, countertransference, the reactions you draw out of me, the reactions I draw out of you, how we go through in this therapeutic relationship to try and understand sort of the dynamics that maybe you're experiencing, have experienced in the past, and sort of stuff that is may causing you some problems sort of currently. Okay, so that's kind of psychodynamic theory in a nutshell. Different than person-centered therapy. Person-centered therapy, again, the idea is to help you provide an interpersonal, provide you with a personal relationship that gives you the opportunity to grow and achieve your potential by being someone who's not telling you what to do and not giving you necessarily advice or saying, okay, here's your assignment to do X, Y, or Z, or you should Michael, go tell Jonathan off because of what he did to you or sort of anything like that, right? What it is if I'm a person-centered therapist, right, you come in and whatever you want to talk about is whatever we're going to talk about. Like, not like psychodynamic where I'm trying to infer things about your unconscious conflicts. I'm just saying, like, I'm assuming if you're talking about it, it's something that's important to you, right? And I'm just here to be kind of a sounding board. I'm here to be genuine, right? So when you come in, I'm genuinely here with you. Like, I'm not sort of on my phone or thinking about something else. I'm sort of there, present, connected with you, and genuine in my interest and in sort of what's going on in your life. Empathic understanding, right? Sort of trying to put myself in your shoes and understand sort of some of the difficulties that, even if it's not obvious to other people, sort of why that may be difficult for you. I'm trying to understand sort of your experience, and then sort of unconditional positive regard, right? Like, I'm not going to judge you. And, sometimes people do things that maybe aren't sort of recommended, or things that if we told other people, that people might have strong thoughts or feelings or maybe judge us about some of the things that we've done or do. My job as a person-centered therapist is to not pass judgment, to understand your behavior from where you're coming from, and the things that sort of providing this as a context for you to sort of find your own way and sort of develop, and so we can just sort of I'm a safe person to talk with things where you don't have to worry about judgment or me sort of being somewhere else in my brain and being empathic and things like that. Then we got our cognitive behavioral therapies, right? These are sort of based on cognitive and behavioral theory, much more directive than either of these, right? Sort of techniques involving psychoeducation and then sort of a skills-based approach is different from humanistic or person-centered therapies. Here, if you're coming in, let's say, Michael, with a diagnosis of, let's say, OCD, right? What I would say is, okay, Michael, here's, based on our research, this is how we know OCD functions, right? Sort of involved in sort of a lot of avoidance mechanisms and things like that. So we do some psychoeducation to sort of orient you to sort of how we understand sort of these symptoms are developed and maintained. And then what we would start doing is doing specific activities, assignments, things like that, to help start to break up some of those patterns that sort of contribute to the maintenance of OCD, right? So it's looking at patterns of behavior that might continue and perpetuate symptoms, looking at problematic ways of thinking that perpetuate things, and then trying to help you develop some active coping skills. So relative to the other two treatments that we talked about, cognitive behavioral therapy, much more directive. Like, you come in, I've got an agenda. This is what we're going to work on today. We're going to go through and sort of help you go through that, give you tools and skills. And the idea behind this is that hopefully, if I'm working with you from a cognitive behavioral perspective, I don't want you to be my client forever. I sort of enjoy our time together, right? But what I want to do is I want to give you tools, skills, so that you can go forward and kind of be your own therapist, right? If you're struggling with OCD, you say, I know what OCD is. I know the things that perpetuate this. I can recognize when I'm sort of falling into patterns. And so I know what skills to go through and use. The idea of giving you tools to go through so that you can go kind of be on your own and sort of do your own thing and not be tied to, sessions indefinitely for however long or whatever. Okay. So these are kind of three modalities. There are others, but these are the three that kind of sort of link into some of the historical stuff that we've talked about throughout this semester. Does that help kind of get a head on a headspace around that?
Yeah, just one quick question.
Yeah.
A good way to describe cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of teaching somebody teaching someone the skills to handle it themselves in a way.
Yeah, and I think sort of any type of treatment is that's the kind of idea. CBT is a little bit more explicit, right? So let's say that Michael, you come in and we're working on social anxiety, right? What we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to talk about. We're probably going to do some cognitive work, sort of think about in social situations. What are the thoughts that come in if you're sort of in situations where you might be evaluated or observed, right? And sort of talk about maybe how you're looking at that situation that might be sort of excessive or not helpful, right? Then we probably do some exposure exercises where I'd have you go through and sort of maybe your assignment for the week is to go through on 3 different occasions, go to Safeway and just ask a random stranger for help with something, right? Having you do that over and over again to start to sort of be less uncomfortable with some of that anxiety. But after we work together for a period of time, like, you're going to have all the information that I have. Like, you don't need me to, you don't need to come in every week for me to tell you the same thing that you already know already, right? So you got, so to describe to people, you got like a tiny version of me in your pocket, right? And so if you're in a social situation and you're feeling anxious, like, you already know what Dr. Clapp's going to say, right? I don't refer to myself as Dr. Clapp, but let's, like, you already know, like, oh, I recognize this is a situation where I'm feeling anxious and I'm wanting to avoid, but I know that avoidance sort of maintains my social anxiety. I know that sort of my fear is understandable given how I'm perceiving this situation, but if I take a step back, recognize that I might be sort of giving this more power than it needs to have. Probably if I go into the union and sort of ask for help in the bookstore, people aren't going to think I'm a dummy. That's why they have a job, is to help people when they have questions. So I'm going to go through and do that because I know that's what Josh would sort of tell me to do, right? And so it's much more transparent. There's not, with some types of orientations, kind of this mystical sort of like, oh, I have all this, like, all the secrets I have, I'm going to tell you. Like, this is everything that we know about social anxiety, how it works. Here's some exercises that you can use to sort of move forward with stuff. So interventions tend to be time limited, skills focused, so that you have tools to go out and sort of do your thing.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Can we just briefly go over the very beginning from quiz 1, all the historical figures and their main contributions?
Yeah. All right. Madison, you ready for this? We're going to speed through it. All right. So, in terms of mechanisms, remember when you're trying to keep these in your mind and trying to keep these straight, thinking about sort of how sort of one movement leads to the next, right? Like anything else, right? Like sort of music, fashion, sort of movies, things that, okay, we're doing this thing for a while, everybody's jazzed about this thing, and then someone's like, no, I don't like that because of X, Y, and Z, and then we move in a different direction. And we like that for a while, and then people are like, yeah, this is dumb because of this. I'm going to do something that's different, and then we move to that and sort of go that way. It's kind of how a good way to think about some of these movements. So structuralism, remember that this was born out of Germany, kind of the first movement in psychology. The structuralism was what made psychology, sort of these are the folks who developed psychology as its own area of science. And what the structuralists were doing, were looking at the structure of the mind, right? And again, these were folks who are hugely influenced by things like chemistry, biology, right? Because these were fields that were starting to develop in the early to late 19th century, right? Recognizing that things in our universe are made of these elemental sort of elements, right? Sort of these are the building blocks of matter, or from biology, right? Sort of organisms are built of cells. These are the building blocks of organisms, right? And so the idea behind psychology originally from structuralism is to say, what are the atoms of the mind? Like, what are the core foundations? What are the sort of basic units of sort of mental life, or sort of the mind and structure and things like that. So the focus was a lot of very specific sort of lab-based stuff, right? Just with graduate students and sort of trained people, sort of doing some introspection stuff, sort of trying to talk about like my experiences of sensations and reaction times and things like that to try and understand what are the basic building blocks. Okay. So we did that for a while, but then we have some folks in America who are saying, well, who cares about what the structure is? Okay, I don't care about the structure. What I care about is sort of what it does. So, like, why do we have emotions? Why do humans tend to hang out in groups? Why is it hard to ignore babies screaming? Right? Like, why do we, avoid things that make us scared, right? And so the idea behind functionalism is not to say what's the structure and the basic building blocks of sort of the mind. Functionalism is focused on like, what does it do? How has this stuff evolved? hugely influenced by Darwin, right? This idea that we've developed capacities to do things because it helps us survive as a species, right? So like we have emotions because emotions do helpful things for us. They allow us to get together. They allow us to sort of know when things are not good or when they are good, friend and a foe type of thing. And so thinking about for these things that we sort of topics in psychology, how do we understand these as helping us move forward? So what's the function of these? Okay. Psychoanalysis, this kind of didn't come out as a reaction to sort of necessarily anything. Psychoanalysis was just kind of going on to develop in Freud based on his private practice and sort of his theory of personality. So having people come in with depression, anxiety. Again, Freud was a clinical neurologist, so he was a medical doctor, wasn't a psychologist because that really wasn't a huge thing at the time. But he's going through and he's working with clients, and sort of based on his work with people and sort of their sort of difficulties, their hang-ups, their what you might call neuroses, right? Sort of developing sort of his theory of personality and human behavior, and sort of using that to sort of understand sort of where people are going, what they're doing, and things like that. Behaviorism, though, emerging as a reaction to psychoanalysis, right? Psychoanalysis is a lot of unconscious stuff that we can't see, can never see, right? It's going on, and so we've got these unconscious desires and sort of the id and the ego and things like that. Behaviorism says, wait a minute, like, if I can't see it and if I can't observe it, then it's not worth talking about, right? What psychology should be is a study of human behavior. I can see you behave, right? I can see you looking at me. I can see Michael looking down at something right now, right? These are behaviors that I can observe. If I can't observe it, it's not worth me sort of studying, right? I can see Michael looking down, but I don't know what's going on. So if you talk about sort of Michael's thoughts and motivations, I don't know what thoughts and motivations are. I can't see thoughts and motivations. What I can see is behavior, right? And so what we see in behaviorism is sort of this intense focus on just observable behavior and understanding behavior as a function of as sort of this learning, sort of stimulus response, sort of classical conditioning, operant conditioning. This is sort of how we understand psychology. Okay. This, however, sort of got people rubbed the humanists the wrong way, right? So we got at the time we've got psychoanalysis and we got behaviorism. Both of these are very deterministic theories. From psychoanalysis, my behavior is completely determined by my unconscious drives and desires that I have nowhere aware of, right? If I'm a behaviorist, everything that I do is determined by my learning history. Like this idea of free will and choice is not a real thing in radical behaviorism and psychoanalysis, right? Humanists came along and said, this is garbage, right? Free will is what makes people amazing, sort of allows people to go through and do fantastic things. With behaviorism, psychoanalysis, so we're talking about fear, neuroses, and things like that. What about all the good things? What about the positive things, right? That's what we should be studying. And so a focus on human strengths, potential achievement, sort of a heavy emphasis on free will, sort of in the underlying belief that people are inherently good. And if we provide people sort of the fertile soil to grow, they will. People will bend towards their most positive selves if given an opportunity, right? And so this was sort of the humanistic approach. And so last thing we talked about was the cognitive revolution, right? By this time, we're getting in the 70s, right? We've got some people who are trained maybe in that radical behaviorist orientation where if I can't see it, it's not a real thing. But eventually we get to a point where the behaviorists who turned into the cognitive psychologists are saying, well, it seems kind of dumb to deny the fact that people do have thoughts. Like I'm doing it right now. I'm thinking about things. I do have emotions, right? I do consider things, right? And so even though I can't directly see you thinking things, what I might do is I might set up experiments to start to infer things about treating thoughts as behaviors. They're just behaviors that I can't observe directly, but I can set things up to sort of understand sort of what might be going on. And so here we see people starting to use the computers as sort of an analog for our brains, sort of this information processing thing, and starting to get back into a lot of lab-based stuff, looking at things like sensations, reaction, thoughts, information processing type of thing. which really is a lot of the same stuff that we were looking at back in a kind of a different light in structuralism, and just understanding it in a different way in cognitive psychology. So that was lecture one in 7 minutes. But does that help sort of reorient you back to that?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no worries. All right. I mean, we're at time, but any other questions or about the exam or things that have come up? Okay. So what I would say is, again, we've got in that video link. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go through and watch every single lecture over the course of the whole semester. I mean, do it if you want to. Sort of replay the hits, sort of reminisce, right? Sort of grab a drink, be like, oh, I remember that joke. That one was a good one. But as you're going through your notes, right, if there's anything that you're having a hard time sort of figuring out, just go through, sort of click through those YouTube videos, be like, okay, that's what we're talking about, sort of clarify your notes. If I gave something that you didn't understand and you can't clarify your notes from the video because I didn't explain it right in the first place, send me an email and be like, hey, I'm having a hard time figuring this out. Can you help me sort of understand sort of this concept theory? Happy to do that too. Okay. So again, optional final will be set up just like every other quiz. It'll just be up. You go through, log in, take it. It's not going to hurt you. But what I would say is that people who go through and shoot from the hip generally don't do that well, which is fine. That makes some sense. It doesn't hurt anybody. But for individuals, because it's all material you've seen before, if you go through, spend some time, sort of get yourself prepped and sort of have a feeling in a good spot, people who prep for this generally do pretty well. And so we'll go through and improve those scores. So just do that. Let me know if you have any questions. But yeah, just remember you don't have to focus on anything from the text. It's just the lecture material. Questions on any of this? Awesome.
I don't want to keep you, but if you wanted to point out anything that might want to be paid attention to from modules 32 and 37.
Module 32 and 37. Let me see real quick here, Jonathan.
Apparently I took 0 notes on this.
Okay.
How do I tank that quiz?
That's all right. It happens. That's why you get drops and things like that. So the expressive emotion stuff, I think that was one that what might have happened is that we didn't have class. That was one that I just sort of recorded. So definitely go back through and take a look. There's nothing super complicated about that. Looking at about sort of just basic emotion theories, the universality of expression. So go back through, take a look at those expressive emotion, that lecture. It was a recorded one that I just did and posted. And 32, and then what was the other one? 37.
37, yeah.
Okay. That was, we hit the end. We actually didn't, we didn't cover too much about the pro-social stuff. I think we might have cut most of that out. So yeah, Jonathan, go back through and watch and sort of just brief on the lectures. So what might have happened is the pro-social relation stuff might have came in at the end of that lecture. We didn't have time to get into it in class, so that stuff might have been relegated mostly to the text. And if that's the case, you don't have to worry about it because we're not asking text questions on here. So I would just go back to the video, see what was going on, and then just make sure that you got a handle on that. So again, with both of those, I don't know. Wouldn't speculate, but it's possible that sometimes people will say like, oh, well, we didn't cover that in class, and then not read the module and then get tripped up on that. Or was a video that we didn't do sort of live in lecture, and so you're always there live in lecture. And if it was like, oh, this was one that was posted, maybe sort of that one got away from you, go through and watch it. And so I would just go through, see if that helps fills in your gaps. But if there's anything in there, just let me know. Cool.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, folks. Well, again, thank you so much. If you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, it was fantastic working with you this semester. Yeah, and good luck on the exam. You guys are going to do awesome. All right. Have a great holiday and stay safe. We'll see you.
Hey.
Thank you.